Okay, I think we're going to get started. Um, Greetings and warm welcome from all of us at Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Peace Now campaign. I'm Christine On. I'm the Executive Director of Women Cross DMZ and also the International Coordinator of the Korea Peace Now campaign. Women Cross DMZ was established in 2015 when we led a historic crossing of the demilitarized zone, calling for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement, the reunion of separated families, and women's leadership in peace building. In 2019, with the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, a coalition of 4 national peace organizations in South Korea, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Nobel Women's Initiative, we launched the Korea Peace Now campaign, a transnational movement calling for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. First, we have Korean to English interpretation, thanks to our seasoned interpreter, Joanne Kim. To listen to the panel, which will be in English, please click on the globe at the bottom of your screen, and select English. If you want to hear Sumi, when she speaks, she will be speaking in Korean. You could also click on the Korean to listen to her, but the webinar will largely be in English. And so each speaker will give a very brief presentation, then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please be sure to type your question in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer as many as time allows. Now, we mark International Human Rights Day with this important conversation, Peace and Human Rights in North Korea, an argument for ending the war. On December 10th, 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, identifying fundamental human rights belonging to all people and promoting that those rights are the foundation of dignity, justice, and peace in the world. December 10th officially became Human Rights Day in 1950, the very same year that the Korean War broke out. After 4 million people were killed in just 3 years, military commanders from the US, North Korea, and China signed the Armistice Agreement, halting the war and committing to return to negotiate a political settlement. That never happened, and after 71 years, the Korean War still has not officially ended. To help us, the good news is that it appears that the US and South Korea are nearing an end of war declaration that is also supported by China. While not legally binding, such a peace declaration is an important step towards resuming dialogue that has been stalled since 2019 and towards the signing of a peace agreement. But when discussions of a peace agreement to end the war arise, a key question often emerges. What about the human rights of North Koreans? To help us understand the important link between peace and human rights, we've invited 2 panelists to reflect on this question and share how peace and human rights can reinforce one another when it comes to North Korea. We're also honored to have remarks from Senor Tomás Ojea Quintana, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in North Korea. We'll start with a video from Senor Quintana, who was appointed in 2016 by the Human Rights Council to investigate the human rights situation in the DPRK. Actually, Echo, can you put up a picture of Mr. Quintana? He's a lawyer with more than 20 years experience in human rights. He also served as the Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in Myanmar from 2008 to 2014. He worked for the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and has represented the Argentinian NGO Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo in cases concerning child abduction during the military regime. So please, let's listen to what Senor Quintana has to share. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me thank Women Cross DMC organization and Korea Peace Now campaign for inviting me to this webinar. I will start with an introductory idea. I believe that during these turbulent, conflicting, and transforming times brought by the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences, it is crucial to cultivate a peaceful environment and a culture of peace in our world, so our fight against the pandemic is not weakened by our own inner limitation as human beings that sometimes make us resort to the horror of war. That is why these are special times to speak about peace. In this regard, we should say that the Korean Peninsula has been in historical debt with the world peace agenda. This long period of permanent uncertainty could be proportional to the trauma caused by the level of destruction of human life at the Korean War. A Korean War that, after heightened tensions and clashes, finally started in June 1950 and involved ultimately the DPR Korea, the Republic of Korea, the US, China, and the United Nations. But not enough valid reasons can defend the extensive status quo of an armistice. It is true that we don't see warfare, that bullets are not flying, that bombs are not hitting. But without peace talks, without even just talks, that obscure reality or even a worse one could be on the horizon. All parties to the conflict in the Korean Peninsula know that. We all know that. And especially the Korean people know that more than anyone. So let's push for the will for peace to take the center of the agenda once again and comply with the sacred right to peace formally recognized by the United Nations in the 1984 Declaration on the Right of Peoples to Peace. Having said that, we shouldn't ignore that the complexity of the situation in the Korean Peninsula makes some people believe that such an approach forgets or neglects the dramatic human rights situation in North Korea. We shouldn't avoid addressing these concerns. Respect for human rights is as important as it is peace. Every human being should be able to live in peace, free of fear and need. That is why I like the webinar title, and I quote, "Peace and Human Rights in North Korea, an argument for ending the war." And I end quote. It is a concrete initiative to address human rights while advocating peace in the Korean Peninsula and understanding the interconnection between peace and human rights. An ideal outcome from peace talks would be an end to the patterns of human rights abuses in North Korea. But we all know that it is not that simple. In my view, a peace settlement could allow for concrete treatment of human rights issues. And let me give you some examples. First, reallocation of resources from military budget to social welfare. That is, social rights such as education, health, sanitation, adequate food, housing, and so on. Second, an incremental expansion of United Nations humanitarian assistance and civil society organizations working on the humanitarian agenda in the field. This will have a positive impact on social and economic rights of people in North Korea. And finally, possible easing of restriction of freedoms due to the fact that the stance of North Korea against the human rights agenda that they call a hostile policy against the country will have to change. If there is a peace settlement, then that argument about hostile policy will no longer be acceptable, and therefore, in the field, the restrictions to some of the freedoms could be relaxed. But in any case, what I believe is that an opening for peace talks could allow for an opening in human rights cooperation and engagement. This is, in fact, a point of discussion that in the context of negotiations should not be diverted. A cooperation mechanism on human rights is necessary to be arranged, and it can include cooperation with the Special Rapporteur, the country Special Rapporteur, cooperation with thematic rapporteurs, with the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, with the Universal Periodical Review, with the Human Rights Treaty bodies, with the Human Rights Council, with the Sustainable Development Goals process, and many others. This cooperation commitment will allow to address a variety of human rights, to explore training, capacity building, awareness, and ultimately to generate the trust and confidence necessary basically to have access to the country, which at the moment has been the most challenging goal for the United Nations. Let me now conclude by saying that I am of the view that a peace process in the Korean Peninsula should always be an immediate option for the parties involved. And if adopted, a peace process will not only address the perils of nuclearization, but also the concerning human rights situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Let's emphasize once again the interconnection between peace and human rights as invoked in the first paragraph of the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states, and I quote, "The inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Senor Ojea Quintana, for your introductory remarks on the link between peace and human rights. Now I'd like to turn to our panel discussion with two lawyers and advocates that have long been grappling with these issues. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Beavers, an attorney, analyst, and advocate focused on national security and human rights law and policy based in Washington, D.C. She frequently publishes legal scholarship and media commentary on these issues and supports civil society organizations as a consultant and strategist on efforts to lobby lawmakers, organize grassroots activists, and conduct advocacy campaigns to demilitarize U.S. foreign policy. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks so much. I really appreciate everyone watching and to Women Cross DMZ for hosting us. I'm especially honored to be speaking alongside Special Rapporteur Sumi Quintana, Chun Su-mi, and Christine An, who have all devoted themselves to tireless work in pursuit of a better future for the Korean Peninsula. It's particularly special to me to be discussing this topic in advance of International Human Rights Day, which is tomorrow here in the US. I know we're on different timelines for those who are in Korea. So for those I haven't yet connected with, I'm a strategist, an advocate, and a lawyer focusing on national security, peace, and human rights. What I want to do today is unpack some of the human rights-based concerns that have been raised when discussions of a peace agreement with North Korea arise, and explain why I don't believe human rights concerns should be an obstacle to peace with North Korea. Just to set the context from the outset and to define our terms a bit, when we talk about human rights, and this is speaking generally what we're referring to are the rights enshrined in the two key treaties, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Under the system of international human rights law, governments that join these and other related treaties agree to protect these rights for their own people and to hold other governments accountable to do the same. The idea underlining these rights is that they are interdependent and indivisible, meaning that one group of rights cannot be fully enjoyed in isolation from one another. Nonetheless, many states place a much greater emphasis on so-called first-generation rights, such as the freedom of speech or political participation, while others prioritize so-called second-generation rights, such as housing and healthcare. On a bipartisan basis, US presidents have spoken about their desire to prioritize human rights in our foreign policy. Most recently, the Biden administration announced that human rights are back at the center of US foreign policy. But on an equally bipartisan basis, those presidents have launched military actions, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and other coercive tactics in the name of human rights. Most often, such measures have had the effect of increasing the suffering of regular people. So I want to begin by offering some general critiques of that approach in US foreign policy before turning to how I see it applying to the situation of North Korea specifically. The human rights framework is an incredibly important tool. I have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights here behind me. It's very treasured in my collection. But I do take issue with how the US government so often places itself in the role of the international disciplinarian, setting both the rules and the exceptions to those rules and handing out punishments accordingly. We see this in how human rights are often invoked to justify withholding normalized relations and peace with other countries. The underlying rationale or theory of change seems to be that by withholding normalization or applying coercive tactics and pressure, we can maintain leverage to incentivize those states to change their human rights practices. But I believe this posture falls apart under scrutiny. For one thing, it's applied inconsistently and selectively. As we've seen this week, the United States frequently allies itself with and sells arms to human rights violators, as we can see in the case of Saudi Arabia. These inconsistencies make clear the reality, which is that human rights concerns, far from being the central motivating factor in US foreign policy, are often invoked when advantageous to justify decisions arising primarily for other purposes. Analyst Peter Beinart has commented on this. He's written, quote, "Human rights were never at the center of American foreign policy. They do not drive American foreign policy so much as they justify American foreign policy," unquote. My other concern is that US human rights rhetoric frequently oversimplifies situations in almost cartoonish ways with easy heroes and villains. Too often, this binary only serves to reinforce the power of the global elite while focusing accountability measures squarely on the world's most poor and underdeveloped nations. Scholar Laila Abu-Lughod has denounced a posture on human rights that, quote, depends and reinforces on a sense of superiority by Westerners, unquote, and has advocated instead for an approach that, quote, asks how we might contribute to making the world a more just place, where there is peace necessary for discussions, debates, and transformations to occur within communities, unquote. Indeed, so often US politicians talk about the human rights situations in other countries as if they have developed in a vacuum and neglect to engage in the self-reflection about the ways that our own practices have contributed to these conditions. So let's discuss next how this applies in the case of North Korea. As a reminder, although the active combat of the Korean War, when the United States led a coalition to intervene on behalf of South Korea to repel North Korea's crossing of the 38th parallel, only to then press forward and cross the 38th parallel itself, ended in 1953, but there was never a permanent peace agreement, only a fragile armistice. The main parties to the conflict, including the United States and North Korea, continue to view the state of war as ongoing. Accordingly, the countries have no official diplomatic relations and continue to prepare for an outbreak of resumed hot war. Additionally, the United States maintains wide-ranging economic sanctions on North Korea. Advocates in Korea and across the world have long called for a peace agreement to resolve the unended state of militarism and hostility. But I've observed that in these discussions, a frequent point of pushback is, what about human rights? What this seems to mean is that peace with North Korea is a gift that should only be granted if and when their human rights practices align with our expectations, or that peace and normalization should be withheld or conditioned as key leverage needed to entice human rights reforms. By way of example, in response to former President Trump's summits in which he spoke directly with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, human rights critics and leading politicians of both US political parties immediately denounced the talks themselves as harmful to the cause of human rights, because they seemingly legitimized an abuser and by placing him on equal footing with the United States. And subsequent media coverage framed diplomatic efforts as in tension with the human rights process. But I want to challenge the underlying theory of change here. The idea that it's possible to coerce or threaten or punish North Korea until it changes its human rights practices does not stand up to scrutiny. North Korea has only adapted to extreme external pressure, become more resilient, and demonstrated that it has the will to bear the consequences. Additionally, peace is supposed to be the norm in relations between countries, and when states resort to the use of force with one another, the goal is supposed to be to restore peace as quickly as possible. I also believe that the metric of our success on human rights should not be the number of times we go on the record expressing our concerns or calling out other governments. The metric should be the quality of life for the humans those rights are supposed to protect. And by that metric, the current status quo is a devastating failure. My thesis here is that there's no reason to believe that continued militarism, sanctions, and pressure are helpful to the cause of human rights, nor should we believe that peace and normalized relations would be harmful to that cause. And here's my reasons. First, the continued state of war and hostility only gives the North Korean government a ready-made justification for its repressive behaviors. Pyongyang frequently denounces what it considers the, quote, hostile policy of the United States as a root cause of its human rights challenges. In its second Universal Periodic Review, for example, North Korea identified US-led sanctions, pressure, and military threat as the most serious challenges and obstacles to its independent and peaceful development, as well as the enjoyment of human rights by Korean people. North Korea has also insisted that the safeguard of national sovereignty is the precondition and indispensable necessity for the protection and promotion of human rights, and cited, for instance, restrictions on freedom of association and freedom of religion as necessary to safeguard the sovereignty against foreign subversion efforts. Now, as unsatisfying and unconvincing as many of us may find such explanations, it is nonetheless inadvisable to ignore them completely. Better would be to ask ourselves how our own policy continues to play into this frame. And we know more broadly that perceived external security threats such as wars or national emergencies frequently lead to repression from governments in the name of security. We also know this leads to governments pouring resources into military might at the expense of their own people's human needs. We've seen it in our own country. So secondly, the unsatisfying reality is we don't have the authority or the power or the ability to dictate outcomes in North Korea or anywhere. What we can control is how we help or harm the situation. That being said, there are many reasons to believe a peace agreement, unlike our current militaristic policies, could lead to positive human rights outcomes. As we've just discussed, a peace agreement and a transformed relationship would remove the North Korean government's ability to point to ongoing war and threats of military force that they frequently invoke to justify repressive policies. Additionally, a state of peace could also pave the way for the North Korean government to stop pouring its resources so heavily into weaponry at the expense of its people. I'll note this is something I hope our own US government will do someday. Another point is that North Korea's extreme isolation makes it difficult for there to be people-to-people exchanges, opportunities to build credibility and trust between our governments and peoples, social and economic opportunities, and more. Such increased opportunities could build the conditions necessary for improved life in North Korea. The isolation also means that it is very difficult to corroborate reports of the human rights situation, which too often means the innuendo, rumor, or overly salacious tales from defectors that cannot be corroborated or circulated as fact. A state of peace could help the truth emerge more easily. And of course, perhaps most importantly, taking the risk of resumed hostilities off the table and protecting against a return to hot conflict that could turn nuclear would spare countless human lives. I want to be absolutely clear. My argument is not that a peace agreement is a magic solution for human rights in North Korea. Additionally, I'm not dismissing the fact that North Korea's human rights record is a matter of concern, particularly the government's restrictions on political dissent, inequitable distribution of resources, and apparent use of forced labor and torture. What I am arguing is that it's telling that advocates of peace and diplomacy are the ones so often asked to stipulate this reality, and never those who are pressing for more militarism and isolation. The underlying implication is that peace is a gift to North Korea and a stamp of approval, as if such a gift were ours to give. My argument is that peace should be the default between nations, and those who argue otherwise should be tasked with explaining why the current sanctions regime, an unended state of war, in any way promotes human rights. And while a peace agreement to resolve the Korean War is not a panacea, it would likely improve people's lives, sap the militarism that undergirds abuses, and create the conditions to more effectively engage on human rights. I'll end by quoting the esteemed UN Special Rapporteur, who we've already heard from on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Tomás Ojea Quintana. He says, quote, "A declaration on peace and development in the Korean Peninsula and a swift resolution of the armistice status would create the atmosphere and space needed for further discussions on denuclearization, less isolation, more access, and respect for human rights." Thanks again, Women Across DMZ, for having me.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Bravo for that excellent analysis. And I am completely in agreement that those who advocate for the status quo should be held to account for how it advances human rights. So now we're turning to Sumi Jun, or Sumi, or Jun Sumi, who is with us at the crack of dawn in Seoul. So thank you so much. Sumi Jun is a South Korean human rights attorney and chair of the Conciliation and Peace Society. She has been engaged on North Korea human rights issues for almost 20 years, both as an attorney and an activist with NGOs that support North Korean defectors. She provides pro bono legal work for defectors who have suffered sexual assault and defectors indicted under the National Security Act for attempting to rescue family members still in the North. She has served as legal advisor for the Settlement Support Center for North Korean Refugees, the Hanawon, in the Ministry of Unification, and is the chairperson for the Commission on Support for Victims of Sexual Crimes in North Korean Refugees of the Korean Bar Association. She also obtained her PhD in North Korea-China relations to understand North Korean defectors. What an honor to have Sumi join Elizabeth. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight on how the unresolved war impacts human rights. Thank you, Sumi.
May I start in my presentation?
Yes, please. We're ready to hear from you.
안녕하세요. 저는 북한
Hello,
인권
my name is Su-mi, a North Korean human rights lawyer in South Korea. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Christine from Women Cross DMZ, Youngmi Cho, and Christine, and also the Special Human Rights Rapporteur, Mr. Quintana, for that wonderful opening. As a human rights activist and lawyer for nearly 20 years, I have supported North Koreans who came down to South Korea. So I would like to discuss how the issue of human rights and peace are connected on the Korean Peninsula. So first, I would like to talk about the human rights issues of North Korean defectors arising from the division of South and North Korea and the ceasefire. Because South and North Korea are in a state of ceasefire, separated by one of the most militarized borders on Earth, they still consider each other as enemies and aim their guns at each other. So when North Koreans escape from North Korea, they cannot come directly to South Korea. Therefore, they must enter South Korea through China or a third country. Because South Korea and North Korea remain in a state of war, and South Korea regards North Korea as an enemy, South Korea's National Security Act punishes those who meet or contact North Korean officials or even those who talk favorably about North Korea. The National Security Act imposes penalties of up to the death penalty.
남한의 국가보안법은 최고 사형까지 처해질 수 있는
And
남한의
recently,
안보법입니다. 최근에는 북한에
South
있는
Korea
국적을
sent
만나러 간 탈북
young North
청년들이
Korean defectors
국가보안법으로
to
검찰에
jail
기소되고
for visiting their
감옥으로 가고
families in
있습니다.
North Korea under this very act.
대북 제재로 인해 생활고에 시달리는
North Korean
북한
women
여성들은
suffer
탈북 후가
hardships
여전히
due
행정처리를
to
받는
international
동안
sanctions against the country.
중국과 제3국을
However,
거쳐서
if they
남한
escape North Korea
기거리에
due to various difficult living conditions, they become political prisoners under the North Korean Criminal Code.
세상에 태어나 보니 북한 주민인 것입니다. 하지만 여러 어려움으로 북한에
They are born into the country and they sometimes, because of economic difficulties, defect North Korea. But by simply trying to escape North Korea, they become political prisoners. Also, they become victims of human trafficking groups who operate on the border between North Korea and China. These traffickers ask North Korean women who have defected three questions. First, are you going to do prostitution? Second, do you want to trade your organs? Finally, do you want to marry a Chinese farmer bachelor? Most North Korean defector women choose the third option and are sold to farmers in rural areas of China. North Korean defectors need a lot of money in the process of defecting from North Korea or China, so they're oftentimes sold to human trafficking groups or they contract with a broker for their escape. When they sign a contract with a broker and defect from North Korea, North Korean defector women are dependent on the broker because they know nothing about the route or method of defection. For that reason, some brokers sexually assault North Korean women during the defection process. There are many brokers along their journey, brokers in the border area between North Korea and China, local brokers in inland China, and brokers in South Korea. If local Chinese brokers commit a crime against a North Korean defector during the defection process, they are not identified as criminals, so they are rarely punished. Because there is no peace on the Korean Peninsula, another human rights problem arises: sex crimes against North Korean women. More than 70% of North Korean defectors who have entered South Korea are women. South Koreans discriminate and despise North Korean defectors because they consider North Korea an undeveloped country run by a dictatorship. North Korean defector women are more easily subjected to sexual violence because of their image as a woman from a poor country. In December 2019, a North Korean defector woman who had been sexually assaulted for more than a year by South Korean army officers spoke out about what happened to her. This is what she said. And I quote, "Hello, I'm a female defector who has been sexually assaulted for over a year. It took a lot of thought, hardship, and courage to report this. It was very hard every day. My younger brother was sent to a political prison camp, and I was a rape victim. But I had to do something in order to avoid my guilt and painful feelings, even if for a moment. It is difficult to explain my injustice and pain in just a few words, but I wanted to find even the littlest willfulness to live. So I took the courage to report this so that I don't hide and cry alone anymore." A significant number of North Korean women defectors are sexually assaulted, just like the case we have seen. In most cases by another North Korean defector, and in North Korea, the status woman is low. And even when a woman is sexually assaulted, it's seen as the victim's fault. Perhaps for this reason, North Korean male defectors view female defectors as an easy target. Even though I'm not a defector, I was also sexually assaulted by a North Korean male defector. I was silenced from speaking about what I had gone through, since if I spoke about or if I spoke out about the crime, financial support for North Korean defectors would be cut off. If the North Korean defectors can commit sexual crimes against a South Korean woman like me, what would it be like to North Korean defector women from the same hometown? In fact, some North Korean defector men coax a young North Korean woman who just arrived in South Korea by saying this, quote, "I can arrange for you to speak at the United Nations." So and so was also given the chance because I had written their speech in English and I got them an instructor tutor. Just listen to what I tell you to do. North Korean defector women who do not know much about the circumstances of South Korea have no choice but to obey the North Korean male defectors who have power in South Korea, and they use these women for sexual entertainment or sexual exploitation. Some of these North Korean male defectors have visited the US at the invitation of US politicians, have taken pictures with US politicians, and used them as their profile pictures. North Korean defector women who are victimized by North Korean defectors are afraid to speak out and can't tell the truth because they think the FBI is behind that person. And because of fear, they can't tell the truth. South Korean soldiers and police also approach North Korean defectors to obtain information about North Korea. And they also commit sex crimes because they are well aware that North Korean women do not report sexual offenses out of shame. As such, North Korean women are victims of the division of the Korean Peninsula and unresolved state of war. Lastly, there is the human rights issue caused by the leafleting propaganda. Since 2005, private organizations have sent leaflets to North Korea using balloons. Since the early 2000s, I have worked in an NGO for North Korean human rights, reporting the status of human rights issues in North Korea through BBC and CNN, and even submitted a North Korean human rights report to the United Nations. Even after being chased by the police, I still participated in sending the flyers to North Korea. The leaflets that I sent to North Korea criticized the North Korean leader with photoshopped pictures of the then South Korean president and a porn actor. And these flyers attacked the North Korean leader with the title Chairman Kim Jong-il's Dirty Woman Relations. At that time, South Korean residents living in the border area protested, saying that the North Korean leaflets were falling on their rice fields and polluting their farms. They also were concerned that the leaflets would provoke North Korea. And for that reason, our group continued to send those leaflets while running and hiding from the Korean police. According to the testimonies of North Korean defectors, the recent launch of flyers to North Korea led to an internal investigation in North Korea tracking down North Korean defectors. These North Korean defectors in the South feared that their families in North Korea would be in danger because of their defection due to this investigation. Leaflet propaganda was also used as a tool of psychological warfare during the Korean War. In 2014, there was actually a risk of war due to the leaflets. North Korea fired across the border as a result of a leaflet balloon launch. Leaflets sent to North Korea by human rights groups are terrifying the border area residents with the threat of war and putting the families of North Korean defectors at risk. Starting from 2005, NGOs in South Korea sent those leaflets. However, North Korea seems to be reacting very sensitively only recently. Why? It's because of COVID-19. North Korea fears the leaflets could become a biological and chemical weapon if it carried the COVID-19 virus, which would put the entire North Korean population at risk. And therefore, it seems to me that North Korea is very sensitive about the leaflets. In fact, even if you receive a leaflet or a plastic bottle with rice that was launched from South Korea, people say that they do not pick them up in North Korea because it is impossible to know who sent the leaflets or the rice. And you don't know if the leaflet or rice is poisoned. However, some North Korean defectors who send leaflets to North Korea are sending out flyers in the name of North Korean human rights in order to obtain the image as North Korean human rights fighters and to gain political asylum in the United States or to obtain donations. Korea is a very unique country in terms of human rights. Even after liberation from the Japanese colonial rule after World War II, Korea was separated into South and North, although it did not suffer defeat. The division continues to this day, 70 years later. South and North Korea see each other as enemies in regime competition between democracy and communism. And the South enacted the National Security Act and penal codes to punish and execute the offenders. And South Korea criticizes and belittles North Korea, and there is a widespread perception that it should be destroyed. These thoughts are directly projected to the North Korean defectors. North Korean defectors, especially women, are vulnerable to various crimes and suffering in China, South Korea, and other countries. No country is free from the issue of human rights. However, in South Korea, the human rights issue of North Korea is used as a means to secure a sense of superiority over North Korea and to defeat North Korea. To improve the human rights of North Korean defectors, peace on the Korean Peninsula is desperately needed. In order for human rights and peace to coexist on the Korean Peninsula, we must think about human rights in both Koreas. Now is the time to talk about Korean human rights, the human rights of people living on the Korean Peninsula, rather than North Korean human rights used as a political tool in South Korea. We must now respect and consider the human rights of border region residents, the human rights of North Korean women defectors suffering in South Korea, and the human rights of young North Koreans who are suffering under the National Security Act of South Korea. The reason why I have opened up and why I've shared my opinions is because Christine and Youngmi Cho and many other women leaders who are joining here today have rooted for me in my journey. So together, building peace and working to build peace, I believe, is essential. And without that, I don't think that I could have made it thus far. Many North Korean defectors wish to go back to their hometowns, and for that reason, they want peace on the Korean Peninsula. I believe that the Korean War has to be officially ended. An end of war declaration has to be adopted, and peace agreement has to be adopted. And only then, I believe that North Korean defectors will be free from human rights issues. And I believe that global women's rights movement are closely related to North Korean human rights issues. If we want to improve North Korea's human rights issues, instead of imposing sanctions, I believe it is necessary for the international community as a whole raise human rights issues in the North and seek solutions. If the issues are raised by an individual country, then North Korea simply view them as a threat against its regime in disguise and turn a deaf ear. Therefore, I believe that it will only have a limited effect. And for that reason, multilateral approach to North Korea's human rights issues is critical. Through this seminar, I hope that on the Korean Peninsula, we can have human rights and peace coexist. With that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Sumi, thank you so much for that really moving and brave testimony and analysis. We're just so deeply grateful to have you present some of these stories that we rarely hear about. I'm going to open it up for Q&A, and some really excellent questions have come in. So I'm going to start with a question to Sumi. That actually, this question appeared twice, but what do the North Korean women defectors that you represent believe about the need for peace and an end to the Korean War? That's the first question for you.
In South Korea, there are two different types of people who have their hometown in North Korea. Those who arrived in South Korea before the Korean War broke out. Starting from the 70s, however, some people defected North Korea, and officially the title that we use or the name that we use for them are North Korean defectors. But in the past, they were called heroic people. In the 60s and 70s, the South Korean government wanted to promote to the world that South Korean regime is better than that of North Korea. And in order to promote that message, we have used that name. Over the years, we've had reunions of the separated families. However, North Korean defectors in South Korea don't have that opportunity. South Korea and North Korea are still officially at war, and they still call themselves each other enemies. So if North Korean defectors in South Korea are told or known to North Korea that they are in South Korea, then their families in North Korea could be endangered. Therefore, North Korean defectors in South Korea cannot meet their families in North Korea, so they go to border regions and hope for the day that they could be reunited with their family members. If peace comes to the Korean Peninsula and if the DMZ is opened up, then I think that many North Korean defectors in South Korea could finally visit their hometowns in North Korea and be reunited with their family members. And for that reason, I think that many North Korean women defectors in South Korea sincerely and dearly wish for peace agreement and the war declaration.
Thank you so much, Sumi. And I would echo that. That has been my experience in all the meetings with North Korean Tarbukja defectors. The second question goes to Elizabeth. This is from Debbie Blaine. Will North Korea balk if human rights are mentioned right away?
It's a good question. Under the current circumstances, that is usually what happens. We've seen the North Korean government respond rather dismissively to concerns that are raised about its human rights practices, dismissing it as a continuation of the hostile policy, denouncing it as foreign intervention and meddling. And so, I'm sympathetic and I understand the critique of folks who say, if we're coming to the table to talk about peace, we've also got to raise human rights. But with the current relationship and the current status, I think it's important to reflect on what the goal is. And the goal shouldn't be to just simply raise concerns, but to improve lives. And so, I think instead of increasing the demands that we are bringing to the initial table for peace talks, making it more likely for the talks to fall apart and for the conflict to remain endless. A better approach would be to take step-by-step measures that build confidence and trust between our two governments, pursue peace first. And in that way, I think we can create the conditions to make those conversations more productive and make us more likely to protect human rights in the long run.
Can I give a short answer?
네.
북한 김정은 이전에 북한에서는
Prior to Kim Jong-un, up till Kim Il-sung regime, when it comes to human rights, they had some sort of education. So human rights is something that is a tool that is used by South Korea and also the United States to attack North Korea. But recently, under the Kim Jong-un regime, sexual exploitation or human rights are some of the things that are taught in North Korea. Some of the North Korean female defectors told me that. So Kim Jong-un obviously studied in the Switzerland, and he obviously was exposed to the concept of human rights compared to his grandfather or father. So for example, I recently met a friend from North Korea, and this person told me that she was disappointed that she have parents even. And because I asked her why, and she told me that there is an orphanage and in North Korea, and Kim Jong-un built that orphanage. And in North Korea, they have a uniform. It's made of nylon because it's more sturdy. And that orphanage feeds 3 meals a day and provides that very strong, sturdy nylon clothing. And she told me that because she has parents alive, she could not actually go to that orphanage. So that's why she was disappointed. So what this story tells me is that once Kim Jong-un administration or regime was installed, in order to submit UN reports, you can see that kids in the orphanage are being looked after. And in the past, North Korea also looked down the people with handicaps. However, now CCTV in North Korea say and emphasize that the human rights of the physically challenged needs to be protected and safeguarded. So obviously for women's and also the kids and also the physically challenged human rights are being looked after. And if you look at UPR report that North Korea submitted to the United Nations, in order to actually prepare that report and submit that report, you have to do some work when it comes to promoting human rights of the socially underprivileged people. Of course, North Korea obviously has a long way to go, but I could tell that it is changing compared to the past. And because of that, I think that when we are going to address and raise human rights issues, again, I would like to highlight that we have to do it in a multilateral way through the UN and other international organizations. That is going to gradually help improve North Korea's human rights issues. But if we have only one country raising the issue, then North Korea is not going to accept it in a positive manner. It's going to take it as an attack. So again, I think that we have to use the organizations like the UN constantly so that North Korea could budge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumi and Elizabeth. There's one, I think, really important question, and this is for you, Sumi. From Ann Wright, retired U.S. Army Colonel, board member of Women Cross DMZ. She says, the South Korea National Security Act seems really harsh toward North Korean defectors and obviously toward South Koreans. Can you talk about how tough it is for South Koreans to get information about North Korea?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. The National Security Act. Well, in the past, the National Security Act paid attention to South Korean people attempting to come in contact with the North Koreans, or South Korean people who have positive images of North Korea. So it was meant to be punishing these people. And we considered them, or these people were considered under the National Security Act as spies, and they could be executed. However, recently, what's interesting is that I've talked about during my presentation the North Korean youth defectors in South Korea, and they attempted to visit their family members in North Korea, and they made it to the border region in China, but they got arrested. The reason why is because between China and North Korea, there are Chinese polices, and also we have South Korean undercover cops, and therefore, if North Korean defectors are there, they would be tracked down. So just after they visited their family members in North Korea, they got arrested by these NSA agents. They were sent to the prison, and they are suffering. So at the end of the day, I believe that South Korea's National Security Act thinks North Korea as an enemy. So contacting the enemy country and talking favorably about that enemy country can be punished. So those of us who dream about freedom and peace, the North Korean defectors and also South Koreans, this is an act that infringes upon our human rights.
Thank you, Sumi. I know we're almost out of time, so I hope it's okay that we could stay on just for a few more minutes. And so we'll wrap up soon. I know it's so early for you, Sumi. So the next question I'm going to lump into two for Elizabeth. And the first question is from Jules. It's hard to believe that there isn't an international lawyer that would find some loophole to present this case as we have. Great case based on laws that were previously written. I know Germany is not the same case, but Germany reunified in 1990 using precepts largely codified within West Germany's constitution. Can Koreans use our own laws and our own constitution to have a peace treaty? Also about the Declaration on the Rights to People to Peace, 1984 by the UN, recognizing basically peace, the right to peace. And then the second question is from Rick, who asked, no country's human rights record is perfect, the US being no exception, but I'd like to know why that would prevent the US and other countries from speaking out against human rights violations in North Korea. I think we can all agree the human rights situation is worrisome, right? Question mark.
Yeah, thanks for those questions to both Jules and Rick. So I certainly can't comment on Korean law. Sumi might have some thoughts about that. But with regard to the 1984 Declaration on the right to peace, it's really interesting. You know, I spoke earlier in my remarks, the traditional view of human rights are about governments and what they owe to their own people. The human rights traditionally recognized as binding international law are mostly found in the Civil and Political Rights Convention, as well as the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Convention. But there is this really interesting emerging movement, particularly led by the Global South, to think about people's rights as opposed to individual human rights. And the proposed right to peace comes from that. And so while that 1984 declaration is not binding law, it serves as a really important first step towards thinking about how we conceive of rights and what do we owe to one another, not just within our own borders, but across borders. And so I think that's a really lovely thing to think about. And more fundamentally, you know, Señor Quintana talked about this in his remarks. Peace truly is baked into the concept of human rights. The entire human rights movement came out of the destruction of World War II. Peace is mentioned in the UN Charter Preamble. It's mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I do think we should see these things as inextricably linked and not in tension with one another. And that goes to my thoughts on Rick's question. You certainly won't hear in my remarks, and I didn't hear in anyone else's remarks, the idea that we shouldn't mention human rights concerns. I think we should always mention human rights concerns. My argument is that those concerns should not be an obstacle to peace. And in fact, that I think taking a peace first approach will allow us to better have those productive conversations. Again, reflecting on what is the goal? Is it to speak out and to call people out and to make sure we're on the record, or is it to find a way to improve human lives? And if it is to improve those lives, then I think we have to challenge our assumptions and challenge our theories of change that so far have not worked. And so I would propose that no one is saying to ignore anyone's human rights concerns, not ours, not anyone's. But in fact, I think we can be better actors in this space when we build trust and confidence and peace from human rights to better flourish.
Okay, I'm going to give the last two questions to Sumi. The first is, who are the human traffickers of North Korean women? And can you tell us a little bit about their backgrounds? And then the second one came a few times, and it's the question about the high-profile defector, Park Yeon-mi, and the veracity, what we know, because there have been multiple reports about whether her testimony is true. So if you wouldn't mind answering that as well too.
네, 아까 국가보안법 관련해서 제가
Yes, with regard to national security, and there's one thing I'd like to add.
저는 이제 북한 관련 논문을
Well,
쓰거나 연구를
I write papers on North Korea and North Korean human rights issues, and
북한에 있는 웹사이트나
in South Korea, we try to access websites in North Korea in order to obtain some relevant information.
되기 때문에
But doing that very act can also violate the National Security Act of South Korea, and therefore most of the websites are blocked. Even in Germany, I had a friend who came to South Korea to study North Korea, but she actually went back home because getting information here in South Korea was even more difficult than in Germany. So again, I think that this is a clear testimony to how difficult it is to obtain information or access information about North Korea in South Korea. And this is because of the National Security Act. I think that having that minimum access to North Korean related issues and information is very challenging. So it's even better, and many actually want to visit overseas to continue their studies on North Korea. Perhaps under military dictatorship in South Korea, people thought that South Koreans learning about North Korea or accessing information about North Korea through websites, then they could praise North Korea. They would attempt to cross border into North Korea. I'm thinking that those are the reasons, and to prevent that, perhaps the National Security Act was prepared. But South Korean people are intelligent people. Just because you access information of North Korea and the websites, and just by reading books about North Korea, they don't feel the urge to cross the border. So I think that this is not a timely act. It infringes upon our human rights. Again, under this act, you can be executed. And I think that it violates human rights. And I think that this is so out of time. So that was, again, I wanted to add. And the question was human trafficking. As I mentioned, I think that there are three different types. First, in the border region of China and North Korea, we have brokers, and inside China, we have brokers, and also in South Korea, we have brokers. So here, we have three different types of brokers, and they work together. So when you try to defect North Korea, and if you have some cash, then, and if you are a woman, then you can give that money to the broker, and you can directly come from North Korea to South Korea. But most North Korean women don't have that luxury, and therefore from North Korea, they have to cross into China, and they get their human rights violated by Chinese soldiers because they're the ones who would permit border passing. And in China, they would encounter Chinese brokers, and they know that these North Korean defectors don't have money, and they try to do sexual exploitation. As I mentioned earlier, they sometimes are trafficked and sold to marry Chinese farmers, and even those in their teens. Because they can't marry right away, they are held as captives in China and are forced to do sexually graphic chattings or stand in cameras to engage in sexually exploitive interactions because they cannot be sent away to marry right away. So again, all in all, I think that North Korean female defectors in China are suffering because of all these issues. Again, workers in the region, in the border region of China and North Korea, workers in China and workers in South Korea are like organized crime gangs, and together they all violate human rights. And the third question had to do with Park Yeon-mi. I think that she is a good sample for especially young North Korean defectors. These brokers tell the young North Korean women defectors, I'm going to make you another Park Yeon-mi. I'm going to send you to the United Nations, just like Park Yeon-mi. I'm going to have you a English tutor, and you can become another Park Yeon-mi. So this is Park Yeon-mi, and her case is abused. Some say that some North Korean defectors, yes, they speak of their own experience about their sufferings. However, there are some cases where they're simply not telling the truth. They haven't gone through any difficulties. But again, that because information is limited and the internet is not accessible in North Korea and there is no freedom to move in North Korea, you have to die in the home country that you were born into. And therefore, in North Korea, you only have limited sources of information and you don't know the general information about North Korean society, business or economy, and etc. However, we have South Koreans and Americans. They have the urge to ask about North Korea from to these North Korean defectors in South Korea. And what they feel is that if they cannot answer, they feel like they don't have any value. So right after they arrive in South Korea, then they actually study the papers that are shared among the North Korean defectors in South Korea. And it talks about politics, human rights, North Korea's business, and etc. So if you look at TV programs, and the reason why the testimonies that these defectors say are so similar is because they are all based on this paper that they study. And they feel, again, North Korean defectors feel that they have to memorize and they should be testifying about those to make them an important source of information for South Koreans and for Americans. And another characteristic is, perhaps I can cite you a concrete example. There is one person that I know, and this person, right before being imprisoned for committing or for stealing, defected North Korea. And this person actually said that he is from a political camp, political prison camp in North Korea. Just by stealing, you don't get sent to a political prison camp in North Korea. But this lady from North Korea said that although she escaped actually imprisonment in North Korea, she told everyone in South Korea that she escaped from a political prison camp in North Korea. And throughout the United States, in many different churches in the United States, she lectured, testified, and spread those fake information about North Korean prison camps. And she earned a lot of money in the process. And so I think that these testimonies, and they share those testimonies because although that they haven't experienced it directly, they feel that first, they have to prove their value by saying these things. And second, they also believe that they should be saying these things in order to earn money. In capitalism in South Korea, they believe that money is important. And in order to survive, they believe that they should say all these fake things in order to survive. And that is why we have so many Park Yeon-mis in South Korea. And she even is serving as a role model for young North Korean female defectors. And in the process, they get sexually abused, sexually exploited by more North Korean male defectors in South Korea.
Wow. Well, thank you for that very illuminating information. I learned so much from you, from the both of you today. I feel like we could go on and on and on, but I know that we are well beyond our time. And so I just, on behalf of Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Peace Now campaign, I want to just thank the both of you so much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and insight and brilliance. I really want to thank UN Special Rapporteur Tomás Ojea Quintana for his amazing insights and being a real champion, especially to challenge the sanctions and how it's harming innocent civilians in the DPRK. I would like to thank Joanne Kim for translating. You did such a wonderful job. And I really want to thank the Korea Democracy Foundation. I see my friend Kim Chan-ho, who I met in Gwangju some time ago, for supporting this webinar, and the Women Cross Team Z team, Echo, Colleen, Kathleen, and all of you for joining us, for asking tough questions. And we will make this webinar available online, and we will share it out to everybody that registered. It would be wonderful for you to share it broadly, because we need to change the narrative. We don't want the concerns, as they are, should be, but to be an obstacle to peace, because when peace does take place, we know that there are greater chances to improve human rights. So I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please read our reports, Path to Peace and the gendered impact of sanctions. We are going to end this war and see the human rights of all people improved in the process. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.